Hello and welcome to yet another exciting installment here in our course. In all seriousness, though, with this module, we are making a really important transition in the course so far. Up to this point, we've been talking about uh, Catholic worldview, natural law, and different other ethical systems, and then looking at Catholic social teaching. That's all been really kind of aimed at giving us the tools to go about doing some ethical analysis of the modern American food system. But now that we've wrapped up our introduction to really ethics in the Catholic worldview, and now we need to shift gears and start looking at different aspects of the American food system, which is really supposed to be our primary focus here in the class. But before we dive right into some of the very specific issues like environmental problems, treatment of animals, or farm labor, or whatever it might be, I thought it would be helpful for people to get an overall introduction to modern American agriculture. In particular, I think it's very important for this class that we have an understanding of this revolution, or the Green Revolution, that took place in the 20th century, because it really has brought about unprecedented changes, not just in the U.S. agricultural system, but really in life as we know it over the last 100 or even last 50 years, being radically different than the way the vast majority of people have lived throughout the vast majority of history. And there's been this real revolution in the way we produce food and the amount of food that we can produce that has fundamentally changed not just agriculture, but also changed the modern world, and particularly U.S. culture, in really ways that no one could have foreseen, say, even 100 years ago. And that's a pretty big set of ideas to get our head around. So I thought it would be helpful to do a little more than just kind of the standard little short reading, and ask you to read Tompkins' book, The Revolution Down on the Farm. Now, I understand undergraduates fairly well, I think, at this point, and I understand that many of you might be tempted to not read every page of the text. And if you were to fall into that category, what I would really recommend you to focus on, if you're going to be a little selective in your reading, is to really focus on, of course, the introduction and conclusion, which is always helpful, especially the last couple of chapters where he talks about the state of 21st century American farming, and then also some of the criticisms and alternatives that are proposed. So that's an important thing to make sure that you understand, because we're going to be referring to that quite a bit as we go through the remainder of the class. And also to get a sense of the introduction there of where things were, say, 100 years ago. And then also as you go through the rest of the book, kind of the middle of the book, to make sure that you at least get a general sense of some of the policy changes that happened. It's not necessary that for our course that you have kind of an intricate understanding of how farm subsidies developed during the Depression or post-World War II era, but it is important to know, have a general understanding of how farm policies developed, and how these crises that came about in the Great Depression or in the 1980s farm crisis, how those have shaped the policies that we have today, at least in a basic sense. And then also to have some kind of basic idea of the technological revolutions that have happened, in particular the development of the tractor, and modern chemistry and all of those things. And then also make sure, I would definitely encourage you to read the chapters where he focuses on the story of his family farming. So if you're going to be skimming parts, you could skim perhaps the few chapters that deal with, agricultural programs in the Depression or post-World War II or what have you. Focus on the story of his family, and then getting the basic sense of what it was like before the revolution by reading the intro chapter or two, and then the conclusion as well. give you a sense of where we are today. And really, there are in a lot of ways kind of two books here, right? And this is one of the reasons I chose this book, is that it gives you, I think, a pretty manageable introduction to the statistics and economics. I know it may not seem manageable, but in comparison to many other options, it's much more manageable than they are. But it gives you this story of agriculture as an industry, right? Looking at the economics of it in terms of profit, in terms of productivity, in terms of man powers per bushel of certain crops. So that's a big part of the book, is telling that story and looking at the economics and the politics and looking at how basically, as he sums it up in a few places, really what happens in the 20th century is that we trade labor for capital and for technology, right? So that we drastically reduce the amount of human labor involved in agriculture, the sheer number of man hours involved, and replace those man hours with technology and fossil fuels, so tractors and combines and synthetic fertilizers. And so that's one big story, right? How we have this transformation from a labor-driven agricultural system to one that's very capital intensive, very technologically intensive, and which allows huge increases in productivity, both in terms of the amount of crops produced per acre, but also in terms of the sheer amount of food produced in the country, which of course is, you know, from reading the book, produces its own problems of what to do with all this surplus food. So that's one story. The other story, of course, is the story of farming life, which he gets at by telling the story of his own family. And you can see, as you follow the story of his family, how it's kind of paradoxical that there's been this huge revolution in farming technology that makes it so much more productive, requires so much less labor, but really does this help farming families? Well, that's certainly a debatable point at best. And as he describes from his own experiences and from his studies, what it in fact does is it drives the vast majority of farming families out of the agricultural life. Or if they continue to farm, they do it as a second job in addition to having a job in a factory or an office somewhere else. And for those that remain full-time farmers, as he describes again in the latter part of the book, those who stick with it are required to really put in at least as much time and effort and energy as anyone working any other sort of job, and have perhaps much more less reliable profits, and really a lot of stress and anxiety in trying to keep up with this revolutionary industry. And so I think he concludes the book really on a fairly balanced, kind of critical basis, and says, well, yes, this one story, the story of the numbers, seems to be a really great success, but at the same time, when we look at kind of the human story of this revolution, the results are much more mixed and should at least give us pause before we simply conclude that this revolution in agriculture has been an unmitigated good. So that's just the quick introduction here to the book and to kind of the big ideas in it. And so again, if you haven't read it yet already, please do so. And again, focus, if you need to, on the intro and conclusion, and then those chapters dealing with the story of his family. What I want to do in the rest of the module is to walk through and kind of give some overall context for the book, and particularly focus on those things that are going to be important for us moving forward in the course. One of the reasons I decided to focus this class on food and ethical issues surrounding food is because it really is in many ways kind of the most important social system that we all are a part of. I mean, when you step back to think about it, there's really kind of three things that we all absolutely need in the most basic sense of the word. We need air, we need water, and we need food. And of those three, at least for most of us, most of the time, we don't have to pay for the water and air, or at least we don't pay very much for the water. But we all do need food, and we all have to pay for food. So we're all involved in this system of American food, at least as consumers, if not as employees for some company or investors or voters, or maybe some of you out there are involved in agriculture yourself or in your families. But everybody has a stake, I think, in the American food system. It's also very, I think, useful as a kind of introduction to this idea of social teaching or social justice and or social sins, because as you can get a glimpse of from reading this book, this is a huge and vastly complicated system that produces our food, right? It's not just as simple as, the books I read to my kids, where the farmer grows his wheat and corn, he harvests it, he takes it to the mill, he gets flour, and he either takes it home and makes it or gives it to the baker who bakes bread, and then they go and buy it. Right? That there's much more involved in that. That you have the technology involved. You have the companies producing always newer, always better, always more productive combines and tractors, fertilizers, pesticides, all these different things. You have the government involved in setting policies. You have trade groups, the different farmers, cooperatives, and trade organizations that lobby for policy changes. You have the big agricultural companies that take the wheat, the corn, the beef, and then process it and send it out to stores and restaurants. So you have all these different groups all working together, pursuing their own objectives, and out of this big, complicated mess, more or less, we get the American food system. And so it's very difficult in many ways to kind of figure it out. But that's, I think, also why it's helpful as a topic to focus on, to think about social justice and how different ethical systems should shape our actions in modern life. Before we get to the complexity, just a minute, I did want to talk to one of the things that really struck me from reading this book is the impact of unintended consequences. That there are so many things that happen in society or in big social systems where somebody is doing something, producing some good, creating some new service, and aiming to do one thing, aiming to do A, but in fact what ends up happening is B, right? So you can see this very clearly in the opening chapters of the book when he talks about the advent of tractors. And as he goes through the book, the better and better modern farm equipment, especially the advent of combines that are able to automate the harvesting process and really dramatically reduce the amount of labor involved, and therefore are able to dramatically increase productivity and efficiency. And of course, when John Deere and these Farmall and these other companies were getting started, I think it's reasonable to assume that most of them set out with the goal of wanting to produce a machine that was going to be helpful to farmers, that was going to allow farmers to produce more food with less effort and lead better lives as a result. And in many ways, of course, that was accomplished, right? As content spells out through the various chapters, the introduction of tractors is arguably perhaps the biggest force of change in this green revolution. But that wasn't the only consequence that followed from the introduction of these tractors, right? That there's all kinds of other consequences that follow as a result, right? With the new tractors, you need fewer people, right? You need fewer people at harvest, you need fewer people to do the planting and to do the cultivating. And as a result, there's less man hours available for people to work. And as a result of that, people are going to look for employment elsewhere. Right? And living in Kansas, I think we're probably all familiar with the fact that a lot of rural communities are shrinking, if not dying, as people who used to be involved in agriculture in local communities have fewer and fewer jobs there, and therefore they leave and head to the big cities to work in different industries. It seems very unlikely that the people coming up with those first tractors really foresaw that as a consequence of what they were doing. And of course, if you're working at a tractor company, if you're involved in making the tractor, you want to make the best tractor you can, right? And so you keep improving it, you keep making it better. And Conkin talks about how that happened from one generation of tractors to the next. They get better, they get lighter, they get more efficient and reliable. And what happens, though, is, of course, they get more complicated, right? And with modern combines, these are huge machines that cost vast amount of money, but they can do really a job that's astounding. If you think about it, and think about the amount of human labor that used to be involved in harvesting a crop, separating the grain from the chaff and from the stalk, and all of these different things that are done by this one machine now. But as a result, these modern pieces of farm equipment are very, very expensive. And so if you're investing $250,000 in a state-of-the-art combine, it's just not possible for that to be economically viable if you are farming just 100 or 200 or 300 or perhaps even 1,000 acres, right? That you need to apply that large of an investment of capital to a very large amount of land. And so as a result, with these growth in these better and better tractors, that spurs along and really accelerates the consolidation of farms, where you have farms getting bigger and bigger and bigger by some farmers buying out more and more of the surrounding farms, in part because it's only by having a large amount of land that you can afford to invest in the most efficient machinery. And so, again, Conkin talks about all this in detail, so we don't need to do it here. But this is, I think, an important point when we're looking at social systems and thinking about the ethics involved in it, is that something that seems to have one particular purpose and doesn't seem to have any bad consequences, who wouldn't want a better tractor? Well, what happens, in fact, in reality when that technology is developed is it does have all of these unintended consequences. Now, some might argue that those aren't bad things. Consolidation is good, that people leaving rural communities and farming to other ways of life is good. But it's at least not an undisputed truth. There are a lot of people who think there is a value in a farming lifestyle, in a rural lifestyle, in smaller farms, and so on, which we will talk about later on in the course. But that's just something I thought was very striking in the book, is how something like better tractors really has all of these social consequences that nobody would probably anticipate going into it. Another big aspect of the book, and one which I admit can get a little mind-numbing in some of the detail, is the effect of policies and how farm policies, and really any policies for that matter, can take on a life of their own. Right? If you read through the book, Conkin will talk about how there are these different agricultural crises, especially in the Great Depression, but at other points too over the past century or so. And at the time, it seems perfectly reasonable to set up a system that is going to deal with this crisis, whether it's a huge surplus of food or whether it's a drought affecting a certain industry, that a system is set up to help farmers through this difficult time. Right? And again, this would seem very much to be not just reasonable, but also in keeping with what we've been talking about in this class. Trying to focus on the good of people and being willing even to pay tax dollars towards helping out farmers in times of need. But as you can see as you work through the chapters, what starts out as an initial attempt to help people through a crisis takes on a life of its own, right? And there are all kinds of consequences of the farm policies that aren't really anticipated, and that many people would argue are a mixed good at best, if not really an important problem in modern American agriculture, right? Where we have, of course, the scenarios that everybody talks about where people are paid money to not produce crops, where the vast amount of the agricultural aid goes to uh, the largest and richest farmers, and all these different problems. And of course, nobody sat out initially to make this nefarious scheme. Now, of course, one of the things that I think you might critique in Konkin's book is that he does have a very kind of rosy picture of everybody involved. You don't really get a lot of allusions to the fact that some of these people might be purposely rigging the system to benefit themselves. But it does seem plausible from his account that that's not the initial purpose here, that these were real efforts to help ordinary farmers. But as in all social systems, once the thing gets set up and running, it can produce results that we don't anticipate, which can be problematic, which many people would say about U.S. farm policies. Then, of course, as I note here on the bottom of the page, one of the other things I think he does highlight is that the benefits do tend to accumulate much more at the top of the social system than at the bottom, right? And he talks about even those who seem to be very successful farmers today are often only able to succeed because they have a second job, or someone else in the family works, or because they manage to meet the criteria for particular government aid or whatever it might be. But that most of those who would even seem to be the rich farmers really aren't profiting all that much from agriculture. Where the profits are really being accumulated is in the corporations that process the food, distribute it, and all of those other branches of the food system that we will talk about later on in the class. And of course, as I already mentioned, part of why this is a difficult topic, but part of also why I think it's a good one to use in this kind of class is that, again, you should get a sense of this just from reading through the book, that the system is amazingly complex. And as Konkin himself talks about, even he, who has spent basically a lifetime studying these issues, can't really pinpoint the causes of particular problems, or who exactly is responsible for these different problems, or how things could be changed, or what we might be able to do to change the system. That when you have this big social system like this, it's exceptionally difficult to figure out what's causing the problems in it and how we should change them. So that's going to be something that we will start to do and try to do as we go through the course. But I think it is helpful to go into it recognizing that somebody who has spent a lot of time focusing on these issues can still be unable to come up with a definitive solution to the problems. And so our goal is not really to come up with a new farm bill for U.S. policy, but to look at small little aspects of the U.S. food system and think about at least what the problems are, and then start to think about what some of the changes might be. All right, sorry about that last page. That was a heck of a long monologue there. I'll try to keep this one a little shorter. But one of the other things I wanted to point out that struck me in reading this book that I think is also going to be a recurring theme through the remainder of the course is looking at these modern systems and looking at them not just in terms of economics. And really, I think in America today, we have conflicts about just about everything in American public life. But if you look at them, even people who are bitterly opposing one another tend to argue really in terms of economics, right? That the questions are what's going to give us the greatest profits, what's going to reduce taxes the most, what's going to yield the smallest deficit. Um, but that's really where our cultural conversation happens, is in terms of economics, in terms of profit and loss, taxes and deficits. And obviously those are important things to bear in mind. But I think one of the nice things, again, about this book is that it shows that that's not the only way to think about life or to look at social systems. That it's not just about the numbers and the exponential increases in productivity per man hour or what have you, that there are real people's lives that are behind all those statistics, all of those numbers. And he also, I think, points out nicely at several points in the book that even within the realm of numbers, there are a lot of things that aren't really captured by the numbers that people trot out. Again, if you've had a statistics class, you know very well how people can be very selective in what they choose to focus on in giving you their statistics about certain things. And there's certainly a great deal of that when we look at the modern American food system. Especially the big corporations in the industry are going to present you a lot of these statistics that Konkin provides about the marvelous productivity and efficiency and all of these things. But there are other things that aren't accounted for in all of those PR materials. For example, work is not just about profit. It's not just about amount of bushels produced per man hour, right? I think this is, again, why it's important to have that Catholic worldview piece earlier in the class, right? That the goal in life is not to maximize profit. The goal in life is not to accumulate the most wealth possible. The goal in life is to flourish as a human being, right? To build good relationships, to develop virtues. That should be our goal in life. And that goal is not necessarily linked to increasing profit. And work, if you think about it, makes up a very significant part of our life. For many of us, it's at least a third of our waking life is spent working. And from a Catholic perspective, and I would think from at least any kind of reasonable ethical perspective, work shouldn't just be looked at as, okay, this is time that I'm kind of blocking off from my meaningful life. This is just time I'm giving to get money to use in the rest of my time. Right? That a third of one's life is not something that we can just sacrifice for money to do fun stuff or money to pay the grocery bill or whatever it might be. That we need to have that third of our life we spend working contribute to our goal of being flourishing people who realize those basic goods we've talked about before. So when we're carrying out our work, we need to be doing work in a way that helps us develop virtues, that helps us develop relationships, relationships with other people, relationships even with the rest of creation, which we talked about in terms of stewardship and in terms of the good of the created world. And so when we're faced, for example, with two different ways to carry out a job, one of which takes an hour, but really disconnects me from other people, disconnects me from the land and from other parts of creation, and another way of doing the job that takes, say, 3 hours, 3 times as long, but during that time I'm relating with other people, I'm enjoying creation. From that perspective, from this larger understanding of the human person, it's not clear that we ought to choose the 1 hour alternative, right? It may be more efficient, it may be more profitable, but it may not really be getting us towards our ultimate goal in life in the same way that the less efficient 3-hour approaches is going to help us grow as a person and not just maximize our efficiency. Some other problems that are come up in the Konkin book about the economic analysis of things is that we tend to really focus on the short term. And you can even see this in Konkin's book when he's talking about the loss of fertility in a lot of the soil. He says, well, yes, there's been erosion, there's been a loss of fertility, but this won't be a real problem in the coming century. Well, That's good, and certainly we are concerned about the coming century. But God willing, our descendants will be here long after that, right? So if we are setting up an agricultural system where we're going to deplete the soil 100 years from now, that might not strike many of us as a really pressing problem, but it could very well be a pressing problem for our grandchildren and for their children. And so economics tends to focus on what's going to be the benefit, what's going to be the costs here and now, and tends to avoid really looking at those longer term issues. And then also, as Konkin points out in the book, there are a whole host of things, externalities or externalized costs, depending on your jargon, that the economic analysis just doesn't consider. Things like damage to the environment, things like the cost of the social upheaval, of the loss of rural communities and those people going to the cities. There are all kinds of costs that go along with this transformation of American agriculture, but those don't show up in the PR literature, those don't show up in the policy debates. It's hard to quantify what are the costs of somebody leaving the traditional family farm and moving to the city. And in fact, in a GDP analysis, it will probably show up as a benefit because you spend lots of money to move and you don't spend money to stay where you are. But there are costs as well. What are the additional costs from the breakdown of the family, from the social support that community can provide, all kinds of things that go along with it. And again, in some cases, it might be a good thing. It might be an opportunity that allows those people to flourish, but it might not. And economic analysis alone can't give us that sort of analysis, can't give us answers to those questions of whether this is really promoting true human good. On the flip side, I don't want you to think that this class is going to necessarily be all about hugging trees and singing Kumbaya. I certainly wouldn't do either of those things in my spare time, even. And I think it's important. A lot of times there's books and movies and even courses that look at food in America and will simply condemn everything and say we need to go back to this idyllic time, at least from my generation, here personified by Charles Ingalls of course, Little House on the Prairie fame. Perhaps some of you never had the joy of watching that. I'm sure you can find it on YouTube or Netflix. But be that as it may, we have this sense of, okay, there could be critics of this revolution. We're going to look back and say we need to go back to this kind of pre-modern agricultural lifestyle. And again, there might very well be real benefits to that. We can talk about that through the course. But I think it's important to recognize that it wasn't a golden age, right? There really isn't, there has never been the golden age that people remember. We tend to make it look that way in retrospect, but at the time there are lots of other problems. And you can see this in Konkin's book. He talks about kind of how isolated his family was, the really limited access they had to education and to culture before the roads came along, before electricity came along. And those things went together with this change in agriculture and in American economic life. Those changes made it possible for him to get the education and the culture that he had and the opportunity to pursue the life he wanted. Certainly, as he describes in telling the story of his family, there was far less discretionary spending. People couldn't afford to buy all of the other things they would want when they devoted so many of their resources, so much of their time and money to producing the food they needed to survive. And so there was much less money to be spent on all the other things that many of us would be very reluctant to give up. And I think there were also real social and environmental issues in earlier generations as well. We're going to talk about some of the problems with modern American agriculture in terms of the effects on the environment and the effects on the poor and laborers. But it's important to remember that it wasn't perfect before either. There were many social problems. Konkin talks a number of times about the South and sharecropping and tenant farmers. There were all kinds of social injustices in that system. And of course, not to mention the huge racial problems during slavery, of course, but even after the Civil War, there continued to be really widespread social problems with the way the agricultural system was set up. And there were also environmental problems as well. People liked Charles Ingalls in Little House on the Prairie. While he seems like a good guy from the books and the TV show, he personified a certain kind of agriculture that Konkin talks about, where with so much land available, you could just move to a place, kind of farm it until you just exhausted the fertility of the soil, and then all you had to do was pack up and move on a little further west. And of course, this did not do really good things for the environment. There were terrible amounts of erosion, all kinds of other problems. So it's not just modern agriculture that has environmental issues. So that's something important, or some important things to keep in mind as we go through the remainder of the weeks in our class. And then to, again, shift the balance or the perspective a little bit here to wrap up the page, it's important, I think, to recognize the role of ideology in all of this. That one of the things that typically comes up when we talk about this move away from agriculture as a focus of American life to other industries, this has often been seen, or is still often described as a move away from drudgery, right? That people don't have to get up and milk the cows and harvest the crops and do all of these things, that we're free to do lots and lots of other things. And certainly there is a great deal of truth in that. We spend much less time producing and preparing our food than people did in previous generations. At the same time, as my Dilbert illustration here exemplifies, I think it would be problematic at best and laughable, perhaps, to say that modern American life doesn't have drudgery. It's not entirely clear to me that it's less of an work, or less drudging work, to be in an accounts payable department in some office cubicle somewhere than it is to be out working in a field. Now again, I've never been a full-time farmer, so it's hard to say myself, but I have spent some time working in those cubicles, and it can certainly be drudgery, if not worse. So again, we have this idea that, some people have the idea that the past was a golden age. That doesn't seem right. Other people have the idea that the past was drudgery and it was horrible and everybody had to slave away all the time. And now we live this idyllic modern life. So that also doesn't seem very accurate either. I think both systems are complicated and mixed, and we need to work through them carefully, thinking about what it is that we really ought to be focusing on, and picking out what's good in each of them, what's bad in each, and then trying to figure out a way to maximize the good and minimize the bad. All right, after a couple of landmark pages there, again, sorry about that, that wasn't my intention. I just get so fired up about this stuff. The last couple of pages here are really an attempt to kind of wrap up and bring together some key ideas from the book. So these will certainly be briefer. If they're not, I'll go back and re-record them. Then, of course, you'll never see this, so I don't know why I'm telling you this. All right. Let's look at the revolution using Konkin's book and talk about, what are really the pros and cons, right? If we're going to aim for finding what's good in these different approaches to agriculture, and trying to minimize what's bad, okay, what are the pros and cons of this revolution that has taken place? Well, the pros, again, are pretty straightforward. We've had these unprecedented amounts of food being produced with remarkably low amounts of man-hours committed to producing that food. And again, I think it's important to note, right, that just focusing on productivity in the agricultural system and in the man-hours expended there is only half of the picture, really, right? Because the labor pool increases during this whole time, right? And so all of those people who would have been working in agriculture if the system had not gone through this revolution, they are off working in other industries. and producing all kinds of goods and services that make up kind of modern life as we know it, with cars and iPods and reality television and what have you. And, that's a mixed bag, but there is much more to the economic picture than just productivity and efficiency in agriculture. That translates into and makes possible uh, huge increases in other industries as well. And again, one of the other, I think, real benefits that Konkin notes is with this transformation in our society, where you have lots of people working on other things, working on developing technology, electronics, and automobiles, and all kinds of other things, that this has opened up the possibility for people to have access to education and culture and all kinds of other good things in ways they never have before, and in ways that they couldn't have taken advantage of to the same extent if they were living agricultural lives where you're really kind of rooted to the land in a real significant way, more so than, say, in other careers. And again, from the American perspective, all of this ultimately translates into real increased profits for the companies and their investors, big companies that make up agriculture. And it also translates into, again, a real increase in the amount of discretionary spending that the average American has or can make use of. With food making up such a relatively small part of the American budget compared to every other generation in history, that means we have more money to spend on other things, like iPods, like better clothing, like better homes and cars and all of those things. So those are, I think, some of the key pros of the revolution. But of course, there is this flip side, which is really part of the reason for reading this book and going through remaining weeks to look at some aspects of the food system in more detail. One thing Konkin notes is that to get this huge increase in productivity and efficiency, there's been a real and dramatic increase in the use of fossil fuels and chemical inputs like fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides, and also the corporations that provide the tractors and the chemicals and the oil. And so modern American farmers and modern American people in general, as people who eat food, have all become much more dependent on oil, on petroleum-derived chemicals, and on the big corporations that provide the oil, the machinery, and the chemicals that are feeding us. Now that it's not man hours that are feeding us, it's all of these other things, which means to some extent that we are dependent on these corporations for our food. For many people, that's a real con. There are also environmental issues. While there were environmental problems in the past, in the modern world we have our own environmental problems with the pollution caused by modern livestock operations, which we'll talk about later. There's the pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers that leach into the water systems, which are real problems, and we'll talk about that in the next module. And there are, of course, all of the greenhouse gases produced by all the machinery and production of the chemicals and those things. So there are real environmental effects from the system and from the revolution. One of the things that Konkin notes but doesn't talk about a lot is also the loss of biodiversity. That previous generations, all the different farmers in all the different regions would have their own particular varieties of whatever crop it was they were growing that were particularly suited to that area. Now with modern systems, with modern hybrid crops and needing, for example, wheat that will work properly with the combines and work with the chemicals that are available, there's been a real narrowing of the number of species and varieties of different species that make up our food. Now again, this may not seem like an obvious problem, but many people argue it's a very serious problem because when you have less biodiversity, you have much greater risk in terms of pests and diseases. If everybody's growing the same potato and there's a potato disease that wipes through an entire country or even over an entire hemisphere or the world, that's a very serious problem. Whereas in the past, there were hundreds and thousands of different potato varieties, and some of which might have been affected, but many others might not have. And so that's a real concern for many people, is that loss of diversity. And of course, what we've talked about before, the loss of the traditional farming lifestyle and the communities that went along with it is seen by many people as a real loss. And then also one thing that we'll look at again further on is the impact on livestock, which Konkin again talks about in passing, but many people would argue that raising animals in these kind of factory corporate models, where most of our meat and eggs and dairy come from today, is basically mistreating the animals and violating the nature that God has given to His creation. So we got certainly some real significant pros, but also some serious cons to at least consider as well. So to wrap up our discussion of the book here, I just wanted to end with a few questions about what we could take from this book and to think about as we go into the remainder of the class. And I think the biggest question raised here is, what should the goal of the American food system be? What should we be aiming for? Now, obviously, to one, or on a very obvious level, the goal of the American food system should be to feed us. But that's certainly being accomplished, right? There's not a lack of food. So given the basic ability to provide for the basic nutritional needs of people, what should be our focus? Many people would argue the focus should be on maximizing profits, maximizing efficiency. And that's the model that seems to be prevailing, at least for the most part, in the modern American food system. Others might argue that our goal should be, for example, this true human flourishing, right, which may not be achieved by the most efficient, the most profitable way of doing business. It might be maximized by choosing a less profitable way of doing things, but a way that allows other aspects of life to flourish and for us to get real goods in other ways. We can ask, in what ways, if any, does our current system fail to meet the goal that we've set? Right? So for some, the system isn't efficient enough yet. It's not profitable enough yet. What we need is more consolidation, more technology, more of the revolution to be carried further. For others, it's the exact opposite, that what we need to do is to undo many of the changes that have taken place and to pursue a different goal. So the answer of what should change or what fails currently is going to depend a great deal on what you think the goal of all of this should be. And then obviously, what could be changed to meet our goal to address those failures is going to be another question. And that, of course, is going to depend on what you think the problems are and what the goal ought to be. The other thing, of course, that we'll be talking about as we go along is, given the complexity of the system that the book lays out for us, once we know what we want to happen, it's going to be still difficult to figure out how can we make that happen, right? There are so many different groups involved, such a complicated system. It seems clear that not one simple change is going to fix everything. It's not like if we get a good farm bill, everything will magically change. Or it's not just simply, well, consumers have to choose better, more environmentally sound choices, and then everything will be better. It seems like what will have to happen, given the complexity of how we got here, is that we will need to have changes in policy, maybe changes in technology, changes in the way consumers spend their money. All of these things will have to work together to make a real change if we decide a change is needed. But again, figuring that out is going to be complicated. And then finally, one of the things, a little bit more specific question that I'm left with from reading the book is to ask, one of the real debates is, do we want the efficiency and productivity of the modern system, or do we want the more kind of traditional, seemingly idyllic lifestyle of traditional agriculture on the other? And it's an oversimplification, but one of the main battles seems to be this one of efficiency and profitability versus kind of agrarian lifestyle. And most of the critics of those calling for reform argue that this focus on kind of a small scale family farm where things are done a little slower, where there's lots of different crops, lots of different animals, then all of that is just a lifestyle preference. That if you want to do that on your own time, that's fine. But there's nothing inherently better about that way of living than, say, the corporate model. And so I think that's a real question that I have been pondering myself. And I lean more towards saying that there is some value to the lifestyle. Now, I'm not obviously a farmer myself. I'm in academia. But I think if we accept that Catholic worldview, this idea of building real, meaningful relationships being important, accept the idea of creation having an intrinsic value and goodness to it, and this idea that we as human beings have been given this particular role of being stewards of creation, made in the image of God. It seems to me like that those aspects can be better realized in this traditional lifestyle more so than in the corporate model. And that there might be a real benefit to that real connection to the land, to a particular place, to a particular community of people. And that it's not just equal to or an option to, say, the modern corporate lifestyle. But that's a question we can consider as we go along. So those are some of the questions I wanted to raise, and I'd be happy to discuss those on Blackboard with you. So, as always, if you haven't finished reading, please do so, and then we can discuss these questions or other questions about the book on Blackboard.